There is an irrational exuberance that comes from up 28% in the stock market. You defined this phrase, irrational exuberance. People talk of the normal cyclicals. Carmen Reinhart heated that nothing's changed. This time is not different as well. And others saying at the zero bound, there's a leadenness to the markets, to the economy. Have we abandoned the normal boom-bust cycles you learned from Franco Modigliano?
I don't think human nature is stable, and I don't see any fundamental changes. In fact, if anything, we have a huge boom in the stock market, a huge boom in the real estate market, a huge boom in the bond market. So this isn't the time when I would say the death knell for boom-bust cycles.
There are two places to go here, Bob. One is to talk about the zero bound and the lower interest rate regime we're in, and the other is to talk on the asset side about asset bubbles. I'm going to let the gentleman of the real yield talk about the lower bound. I'm going to talk to you right now about the clear understanding in this valley, which is all that's going on has led to an irrational exuberance in the equity markets, and at the same time, bond price up, yields down. Is this an era, a moment, a 2020 of irrational exuberance?
But it doesn't, yeah, the word exuberance suggests excitement. And it doesn't seem as exciting as it did in 1999 at the previous big peak. I call it the millennium boom. There was new technology that was really strikingly different. It was the internet boom, the dot-com bubble. It doesn't feel like that now. But I still think it doesn't mean it can't collapse.
And Bob and John Farrell, that's what Bob Prince would suggest as well, is that it's not 1999, and that's where he goes into the theme of leadness.
I'm just wondering how you're thinking about some of these issues at the moment. We've had so much pushback to that statement about the boom-bust cycle ending. There was a front cover in Barron's over the previous weekend which said Dow 30K, and even though that's just around the corner, there was a ton of pushback against that as well. Just in terms of human behaviour, Professor, the amount of pushback, can we take that as a sign that actually still, if there's enough doubt, then there's not a lot of exuberance?
Exuberance is a basket that you might put, but there's different moods, different human emotions have coloration, and they attach to certain notions of what they remember and what might happen. We also have these confidence indexes, and people seem to think that that summarizes confidence, but confidence can mean so many different emotions. So right now, we are in a kind of politically dominant, have you heard about these impeachment hearings?
Yeah.
So,
no, we're here in Happy Valley.
Carry on, Professor.
So the mood is always qualitatively different. When we're trying to predict bubbles, we're trying to predict the human mind.
Yeah.
And it's very complicated. Now, I think that people know that stocks are highly priced and real estate is highly priced. Other major corrections didn't give any early warning. And you might have a sense, though, that there are doubts on people. The doubt about the valuation of the market is there, and doubts about our president and what will happen with the next year are prevalent right now. So I don't see that it's a time when we can't have a major correction down.
Professor, you've talked about a really important concept in your book, Economic Narratives, and you did a fantastic job, I have to say that, in that book, of just taking quite complex things with real data, real math behind it, and made it really digestible and easy to understand. We have an economic cheerleader in the White House. You've made this point. You bring up the impeachment proceedings. The impeachment proceedings are happening. The trial is taking place. And yet the President of the United States is in Davos, Switzerland, taking a victory lap about the economy.
Yes, right.
Now, we can joke about these issues. You think they're important. Why is that important?
See, this is one place where I tend to lavish praise on Trump. He does understand narratives. And he knows how to experiment with them, try them out in front of audiences, and go for the ones that work. That's the technology of modern narrative building. So I think he is partly responsible for the so-called strong economy. I don't like to use that word. We used to talk about hyper-speculative economies or overheated economies. You don't seem to hear that language.
Right, right. Well, we don't see that with the GDP where it is versus where it was 20, 30 years ago, real GDP. If you're just joining us on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, Robert Shiller with us, the laureate of Yale University, always a spirited conversation, 5 ways to go with him. And today we really talk about some of the cycles, the oddities of the conversations we've heard here in Davos as we come back to New York. We'll be with you on Monday as well. Bob Shiller, so much of this is about the realization that interest rates have come down, down, back to where they were decades and decades ago. And Ray Dalio, Bob Prince, with some heartfelt emotion, not talking their book, are saying this time is different, a Rogoff-Reinhardt phrase, because we're with the lower interest rates, lower bound, and negative interest rates. Can you state this time is different because of negative rates in this Switzerland?
Yeah, the negative rates are a surprise, but they're not that negative. I think
that's the heart of the matter, is we didn't get to the amplitude described by Ken Rogoff or described by the late Marvin Goodfriend, did we?
Actually, the low interest rates is a sign that the Fed can't do as much as it did to resuscitate the economy in the past. That's a cause for alarm, not confidence.
We could sit here and say the boom-bust cycle is dead and still be depressed, because ultimately what it suggests, and what Bob Prince of Bridgewater suggested earlier this week, is that central banks are boxed in, they can't stimulate and they can't tighten, and ultimately we might be left with something that looks a little bit more like Japan. Not his words precisely,
right.
but my interpretation
That's the narrative,
of his words.
the Japan narrative.
How important is it to push back against that narrative at the moment, Professor?
What do you mean?
Is that something that can just sort of grip everything and everyone?
See, that has been the narrative of this of the long expansion. We're going through the longest expansion, but it's also the slowest expansion. And the slowness has something to do with that idea. It's also called secular stagnation. And there are people inventing reasons for it, like demographics, the baby boomers.
Right.
But I think it's also just kind of a new, as Keynes said, a conventional basis of valuation. We're just kind of used to these low interest rates, and the surprising thing is long rates are or even negative, going way out.
Well, then what is your prescription to play off of your wonderful book, Finance and the Good Society? Let's bring in the laureate Ned Phelps of Columbia. Dynamism and the Good Society. Robert Gordon of Northwestern would suggest we're not going to recapture the dynamism of another time. Baloney, we don't have a choice. We must recapture that dynamism. How do you do that? What's the real economy process, not to eliminate the boom or the bust, but to make it more booming?
Yeah, booms and busts aren't that bad if they focus attention on business. And they bring people into thinking about business. If you shut down that, people would return to gambling on a higher.
How do we get
just a game?
Bob Shiller, how do we get to the dynamism that Ned Phelps has been so eloquent about recently?
Yeah, I'm a big admirer of Phelps. I don't know that he has I think it's hard to actually bring it back because it depends on narratives. Horatio Alger, you've heard of him.
He was an economist. Where was he?
He wrote a number of books for boys, showing Bill Gates type boyish figures who make it really big in this novel.
Okay, so all the Horatio Alger people are up in this valley. Our listeners and our viewers, they're kids. They're saying, we don't accept 2% GDP. I don't want to go back to Morning in America, but I want to find that dynamism. What is your prescription to get from point A to point dynamism?
Well, one thing that we're really struggling with is a feeling of obsolescence. People today, some of them are inspired by the digital revolution and the things that are happening, but others of them feel that they're going to be left behind. That's a real problem. You bring up Phelps. He wants to have, in his book, Rewarding Work, he wants to have subsidies to corporations that hire low-income people. And so it's a face-saving way of subsidizing and reducing the sense of inequality. Now, that's not a direct answer to your question, how do we get dynamic? The U.S. is kind of the center for dynamism. We ought to be able to get it back. So I think Donald Trump, again, I'm praising Donald Trump.
You are.
Okay, it's a Surveillance Break exclusive here. Someone from Yale University
It's praising the President of the United States.
Finish up with one more thought on the president, please.
But he also couples that with unpredictability, which is a hamper on business. If you don't know what he's going to do next.
Well said.